Michael patrolled the aisles of the small convenience store, his eyes scanning the room with the casual intensity of someone who has seen far too much. The store was filled with the usual bustle of a Monday evening, people moving with the brisk efficiency that signaled the end of a long day. As the overhead fluorescent lights hummed softly, Michael's gaze shifted, almost instinctively, toward the back. There, near the snacks aisle, a young girl caught his attention. She couldn't have been older than 11 or 12, a slight figure draped in an oversized hoodie that swallowed her tiny frame. Her backpack hung loosely on one shoulder, too large for someone her size, making her appear almost lost amidst the rows of towering shelves. Her movements were quick but deliberate, too deliberate, perhaps. Michael's experience told him to pay attention to the subtle signs, a nervous glance over her shoulder, the way her fingers brushed the corner of a snack pack before retracting. It wasn't uncommon for kids to wander into the store, often lured by the promise of candy or sodas. But something about this girl seemed different. Maybe it was the way she hunched her shoulders, as if trying to make herself invisible. Maybe it was the fear lurking behind her eyes when she realized he was watching. Michael stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle her. He knew better than to jump to conclusions. Life had taught him that much. Yet, in this world, appearances could be deceptive, and assumptions could be dangerous. With every step, he thought about the stories he'd heard about kids who came from broken homes or who had nowhere else to go. He thought about his own past, how easy it would have been to end up on the streets, labeled as a problem simply because of the color of his skin. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to show he was aware, but far enough not to be intimidating. "Hey there," he said gently, his voice a soft rumble in the otherwise quiet aisle. "You looking for something?" The girl froze, her eyes wide as she met his gaze. For a heartbeat, Michael saw something familiar in those eyes, something raw and aching. And then it was gone, replaced by a guarded look as she shrugged one shoulder and glanced away. "I'm just looking," she muttered, barely loud enough to be heard. Michael nodded, maintaining his casual stance. "That's cool. Take your time. Just let me know if you need help." He lingered for a moment longer before turning and continuing his patrol, but his thoughts remained with the girl. This wasn't just about catching a potential shoplifter. This was about seeing a person who had slipped through the cracks, someone society would rather ignore. Michael had always prided himself on noticing the little things. It was a talent that had kept him grounded, yet wary, in a world divided by invisible lines of race and privilege. As he walked down the quiet street lined with neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly painted picket fences, something caught his eye: a girl, no older than 12, darting glances over her shoulder. She moved with a sense of urgency, her small frame tense like a coiled spring. Her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and determination, scanned the surroundings, absorbing every detail like a wary animal sensing a predator nearby. Every few steps, she would pause, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. Michael slowed his pace, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. This was not the behavior of a child simply wandering the streets. There was something more, a wariness that went beyond youthful mischief. It was a look he recognized. It was the same look he had seen too many times in his own reflection during his youth, the look of fear. Was she running away from something, or was she running towards something? He continued to observe quietly from a distance, blending into the background of a world where people like him were often seen but rarely heard. The thought occurred to him that, had the roles been reversed, any sudden movement from him might have been misinterpreted: a large black man following a young girl in a neighborhood that tolerated his presence, but never quite accepted it. But here, in this moment, it was her fear that drew him closer. Something was wrong, and as much as he knew better than to interfere, he couldn't turn away. The girl's gaze swept across the street, and for a brief second, their eyes locked. 1,000 emotions flashed across her face: surprise, suspicion, and perhaps a glimmer of recognition. Michael took a step forward, heart heavy with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest danger a child could face came not from strangers, but from those closest to them. "Hey kid," he called softly, keeping his voice low and gentle. "You okay?" She froze, eyes widening further, like a deer caught in headlights. Then, without a word, she turned and bolted down the street. Michael hesitated, torn between chasing after her and respecting her obvious desire to get away. But some instinct honed by years of living on the edge of a society that judged by skin and class told him to follow. What was she so afraid of? And more importantly, who was she afraid of? As he started walking in the direction she had disappeared, he couldn't help but wonder if, in a world so quick to define people by their appearance, the only thing that truly separated him and that girl was not their skin color, but the fact that he was no longer running. But perhaps in the end, they were both still trying to escape the same shadow. Michael entered the small grocery store, the bell above the door chiming softly to announce his presence. The smell of fresh produce and the distant hum of a radio playing soul music filled the air. He was just a customer, like anyone else. But he knew that wasn't entirely true. In a neighborhood like this, being a black man walking into a predominantly white-owned store was enough to make heads turn. It didn't matter that he had been here countless times before. His presence was always a statement, always a question. He glanced around casually, his gaze landing almost instinctively on the same girl he had seen earlier on the street. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her small form flitted from aisle to aisle, a deliberate randomness to her movements that piqued his suspicion. She seemed too focused, too tense for a child pretending to shop. Michael pretended to browse the shelves, keeping her in his peripheral vision. He watched as she picked up a can of soup, turning it over in her hands as if contemplating its purchase, before placing it back with the smallest hint of frustration. She repeated the same routine with a box of cereal, a bag of flour, even a jar of pickles, each time putting the item down with the same dissatisfied sigh. But then her routine shifted. She glanced over her shoulder, just for a split second, and a ripple of something sharper, something desperate, flashed across her face. With a quick, practiced motion, she slipped a small box of powdered milk into her worn backpack. Her eyes darted to the door, and Michael felt his heart drop. He stepped back, giving her space, not wanting to startle her. He knew how this would look: a young white girl stealing from a store, and a black man standing nearby, watching. The image alone was enough to spell trouble. He should walk away. Common sense screamed at him to turn his back and let her face the consequences of her actions. But he couldn't. Not when he understood, on a level so deep it ached, that sometimes people did things they weren't proud of because they felt they had no other choice. The girl's fingers curled around a second box, but then she hesitated, her face tightening with fear and guilt. Michael found himself holding his breath. If she took one more step towards that door, everything would spiral. He could see it in his mind: the store owner's eyes narrowing, the calls to the police, the accusations that would be thrown at her. And him, just by being here, just by watching, he would become a part of that narrative. A black man, seen as an accomplice in a crime he hadn't committed. But what weighed on him more was the question: what drove her to this? Hunger, poverty, or was she just another troubled kid, lashing out at a world that had already dismissed her as insignificant? As she turned, backpack clutched tightly to her chest, Michael knew he had only seconds to decide. He moved swiftly but silently, slipping into the next aisle, then the next, keeping her in his sight as she headed towards the exit. She was fast, but so was he. And when she pushed through the door, her face flushed with the thrill of a near escape, she almost ran straight into him. For a moment, time stood still. The look in her eyes, panic, defiance, and something like shame, froze them both. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything to diffuse the tension, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say that wouldn't make things worse? "Hey," he murmured softly, hands held up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not gonna hurt you, I just wanted to see if you're okay." She stared at him, chest heaving, fingers clutching the straps of her backpack like a lifeline. And in that gaze, Michael saw more than just a girl who had stolen from a store. He saw a child caught in a system that had failed her long before she ever walked through those doors. He saw a reflection of his own struggles, his own battles to survive in a world that judged him by the color of his skin before he even opened his mouth. "Are you hungry?" he asked quietly, carefully. "If you need food, there are other ways. I can help." For a long, agonizing second, she just stood there, staring at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. Then, slowly, her gaze softened, the hardness in her posture melting just a fraction. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "Why?" she whispered, suspicion lacing her voice. "Why would you help me?" Michael swallowed, searching for the right words. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally, "to be scared, to feel like you don't have a choice, and because no one should have to feel that way." Her eyes flickered, doubt and uncertainty warring with the instinct to run. But then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It was the smallest of gestures, but to Michael, it felt like the beginning of something fragile, something important. "Come on," he said gently, stepping aside to let her pass. "Let's talk. I'll buy you some food, and we'll figure out what to do from there." As they turned back towards the store, Michael knew that this moment wouldn't change the world. It wouldn't fix the racism or the poverty or the endless cycle of judgment that people like him, and perhaps people like her, faced every day. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all you needed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, turning the rows of parked cars into a labyrinth of steel and glass. The bell on the grocery store door had barely finished its soft chime when Michael burst through, eyes already locked on the small figure darting away. She was faster than he expected. Her movements were precise, agile, like she'd done this 100 times before. Michael felt a surge of something like disbelief as she weaved through the maze of vehicles with a fluidity that spoke of experience. This wasn't just a panicked run, it was the practiced escape of someone who knew what it was to be chased. For a split second, he hesitated. Chasing a scared girl, especially one who looked so much younger and smaller than him, went against every instinct. But he had seen that look in her eyes, a mix of fear and desperation that gripped his chest like a vice. She needed help, whether she knew it or not. "Wait," he called, his voice carrying over the parking lot. But she didn't wait. If anything, she only sped up, her slight frame slipping between cars and around obstacles with the grace of a shadow. Michael pushed himself harder, lungs burning as he tried to close the distance. He wasn't an athlete, hadn't run like this in years, yet something in him refused to let her go. Cars blurred past in his peripheral vision, the sound of their engines blending with the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement. The girl's backpack, a flash of faded blue in the sea of metal, bobbed up and down as she sprinted towards the far end of the lot. He could almost hear the rapid thud of her heart, the adrenaline-fueled drive to escape overpowering everything else. "Please stop," he tried again, his words lost in the wind as she vaulted over the low divider separating the parking lot from the street beyond. For a moment, Michael thought he had lost her. She disappeared between two sefis and his heart clenched. But then, there a flicker of movement, a blur of dark hair, and she was back in his line of sight, sprinting across the sidewalk and into the street. Michael swerved around a parked truck, skidding to a halt just as a car zoomed past, honking angrily. He caught a glimpse of her on the other side, hesitating for the briefest of moments before bolting again, her small feet pounding against the asphalt. She was heading towards an alleyway, a narrow, shadowed gap between two brick buildings. He forced himself to keep going, legs straining with the effort. Why was she running like this? What was she so afraid of? They reached the mouth of the alley, and Michael slowed, his chest heaving as he searched the darkness. There she was, halfway down, pressed against the side of a dumpster, trying to make herself small, invisible. The sight twisted something deep inside him. "Hey," he gasped, holding up his hands in a show of peace. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The girl's eyes, wide and wild, darted around like a cornered animal's. She looked ready to bolt again, and Michael knew that if she did, he might lose her for good this time. "I just want to talk," he said softly, taking a cautious step forward. "I know you're scared, but running like this, whatever you're running from, it's not going to get better." Her gaze narrowed, suspicion flaring. "What do you know?" she spat, the words fierce despite her trembling frame. "You don't know anything." Michael swallowed, willing his voice to remain steady. "Maybe I don't know your story, but I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think that the only way out is to keep running. But it doesn't have to be like that." For a long, tense moment, they stood there, separated by just a few feet but divided by years of pain and mistrust. She shifted, eyes flitting towards the end of the alley, calculating the distance. "If you want to go, I won't stop you," Michael murmured, stepping back. "But I'm asking you to stay, Just for a minute. Let me help." The girl blinked, surprise flickering in her gaze. She glanced at him, then at the open street beyond, where freedom, or at least the illusion of it, beckoned. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered her shoulders, some of the tension ebbing from her posture. "Why," she whispered, the word barely audible over the rush of blood in Michael's ears. "Why would you help me?" Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I know what it's like to be followed. To be judged for what people think you are, not who you actually are. And I don't want that for you." Her eyes searched his face, looking for lies, for hidden motives. Finding none, she finally let out a shaky breath, the fight draining out of her. I didn't mean to," she started, but Michael shook his head gently. "It's okay," he said softly. "We'll figure it out. Together." The alleyway was narrow, dark, and suffocating. Brick walls towered on either side, the dim light of the setting sun casting everything in long, ominous shadows. Michael watched as the girl's foot caught on a loose stone, and before he could even call out, she stumbled forward. Her body pitched sideways, arms flailing as she lost her balance. No, the word burst from his mouth as he lunged forward, just barely catching her by the arm before she hit the ground. For a second, everything froze. The world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, Michael's fingers gripping her thin arm, and the girl's wide, terrified eyes staring up at him. And then she moved. "Let go," she screamed, the sound piercing the silence of the alley. Panic twisted her features, turning her face into a mask of raw, unfiltered fear. She thrashed violently, her small frame exploding with a force that stunned him. Michael tightened his grip instinctively, but she was stronger than she looked. Hey, he gasped, struggling to hold on as she twisted and kicked. "Calm down. I'm not going to hurt you." But she wasn't listening. She was lost in her own world of terror, fighting with every ounce of strength she had. Her backpack swung wildly, the contents clattering as she jerked back and forth. She clawed at his hands, nails digging into his skin. Michael winced, but refused to let go. If she got loose, there was no telling what might happen. "Stop," he pleaded, ducking his head as her elbow flew towards his face. "Just stop, please." But she couldn't hear him. All she knew was that she was trapped, held by a man much larger, much stronger than her. A man she probably saw as a threat, not a protector. And in that moment, Michael felt a surge of bitter realization. He understood, in a way that cut deep to her, he wasn't just Michael, he was a shadow looming over her, a faceless figure she couldn't trust. A black man in a society that had already painted him as dangerous, whether he deserved it or not. "Let me go," she sobbed, voice raw with desperation. She twisted again, using her entire body to try and wrench free. The ferocity of her struggle caught him off guard. She was so small, so slight, how could she have this much fight in her? "Listen," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you, I just want to help." But the words meant nothing to her. She only screamed louder, her cries echoing down the alley. Fear coursed through him, cold and sharp. What if someone heard? What if someone heard? What if they saw them like this, a black man gripping a struggling white girl in a dark alley? It wouldn't matter what the truth was. All they would see was a threat, a predator, a monster. "Please," he whispered, loosening his hold just enough for her to catch her breath. "I'm not your enemy." She froze, panting heavily. Sweat glistened on her forehead, her cheeks flushed with exertion. For a heartbeat, their eyes met his, pleading hers, wild and defiant. And then, something shifted. Her gaze flickered, confusion softening the hard lines of her face. Why won't you let me go?" she choked out, her voice trembling. There was no anger now, only pain. Only the kind of fear that didn't come from being chased, but from years of running. Michael swallowed hard, releasing his grip slightly. Because I know what it's like to feel like no one's on your side," he said softly. "To feel like you have to fight the whole world just to survive." She stared at him, eyes searching his face. For the first time, she seemed to really see him not just as a stranger or a pursuer, but as a person. Her struggle slowed, then stopped entirely. Michael let out a slow breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "I'm sorry for scaring you, but I couldn't just let you run off like that. Not when I know what it's like." Her chest heaved, silent tears streaking down her cheeks. I thought. I know, he whispered, gently releasing her arm. She didn't move, didn't bolt like he expected. Instead, she stood there, shaking, her small body racked with silent sobs. Why, she finally managed, her voice a broken whisper. Why would you care? Michael hesitated, then knelt down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. Because he said softly, someone has to. And if I walk away now, what happens the next time you need help? What happens when there's no one left who cares? She blinked, eyes wide, the fight in her gaze replaced by something far more fragile: hope. It was small, barely there, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long, dark night, but it was enough. Enough for him to keep going. I'm Michael, he said gently, offering a hand but not moving any closer. And I want to help you, if you'll let me. For a long, agonizing moment she just looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his, tentative and trembling. I'm Annie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael smiled softly, relief flooding through him. It's nice to meet you, Annie, he murmured, his voice gentle. Now, let's get out of here. We can talk, figure things out together. Annie stared at him for a moment longer, then nodded just once, a small, shaky nod. And as they stood there, side by side in the fading light, Michael knew that this fragile, tentative connection was the beginning of something more. Something that could change them both. Because sometimes the strongest fight wasn't against others. It was against the shadows inside us, the ones that whispered that we were alone, that no one would care. And for Annie, and maybe for him too, this was a battle worth fighting. Together. Michael and Annie stood in the alley, their breaths visible in the cool evening air. The city's distant hum buzzed faintly in the background, but in this narrow space, the world felt small and fragile. The girl's shoulders were still shaking slightly, her eyes red-rimmed and wary as she hugged her backpack close to her chest. Michael took a slow, steadying breath, trying to ease the tightness in his throat. He needed to know what she was running from, what she was so desperate to hide. But more than that, he needed her to trust him. To see that not everyone she met in dark alleyways was there to harm her. Annie, he murmured softly, lowering himself to her eye level. I need to know what's in your backpack. Her reaction was instant. Her entire body went rigid, and the wild, defiant look returned to her eyes. She clutched the bag tighter, the worn fabric crinkling under her small hands. No, she whispered, voice thin and brittle. It's mine. Michael held up his hands, palms open in a gesture of peace. I know, and I'm not trying to take it from you. I need to see what you have, just to understand. But she shook her head furiously, taking a step back. No, she repeated, louder this time, her voice trembling. You don't understand. Annie, please, Michael interrupted gently, his gaze soft but unyielding. I'm not here to judge you, I'm here to help. But I can't do that if I don't know what's going on. For a long, agonizing moment, she just stared at him, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Then, slowly, as if moving through molasses, she lowered the backpack to the ground. Her fingers fumbled with the zipper, and Michael could see how badly she was shaking. Every part of him wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but he stayed still, giving her the space to make the choice on her own. With a small, defeated sigh, she pulled the zipper open and reached inside. Michael held his breath as she withdrew the first item, a small, worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one eye missing. It was the kind of toy a child would cling to in times of fear, a reminder of better days, of safety. He felt a pang of sorrow as he imagined her clutching it in the dark, alone and scared. Next came a crumpled sandwich wrapped in plastic, a sad, makeshift meal. The bread was slightly moldy, and the meat looked like it had seen better days. Michael's heart twisted painfully. Was this all she had to eat?
And then, with a look of deep shame, Annie pulled out the last item, a small, unopened box of sanitary pads. She glanced up at him, eyes glistening, her lip trembling as she shoved it back into the bag.
It's just stuff, she mumbled, her voice barely audible. It's nothing. But to Michael, it was everything. He stared at the pitiful collection in her backpack, the toy, the food, the pads, and felt an overwhelming wave of understanding wash over him. This wasn't a thief's hoard. It wasn't the loot of a child out for trouble. It was survival. It was the bare minimum of what a young girl needed to hold onto her dignity, to keep a semblance of normalcy in a life that had clearly stripped everything else away. "Annie," he whispered, his throat tight. Are you living on the streets?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The answer was written in the way she hunched over the bag, as if shielding it from the world. In the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of an adult's burden. In the way her eyes, so young yet so old, refused to meet his. "Hey," Michael said softly, his voice breaking the silence like a fragile promise. "It's okay. I'm not mad. I wish you didn't have to go through this, alone." She sniffed, wiping at her eyes angrily. "I'm fine," she muttered, though the words rang hollow. "I don't need anyone's pity." Michael shook his head slowly. "It's not pity," he murmured. "It's wrong. It's wrong that you're out here, scared and alone, with nothing but a teddy bear and a few pieces of bread. You deserve more than that. You deserve to feel safe, to have people who care."
Her gaze flickered to him, something like disbelief mingling with the defiance. "Why?" she whispered, her voice so small, so broken. "Why would you care? You don't even know me."
Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully, because he said quietly, "I've been where you are. Not in the exact same way, but I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one sees you, or worse, like they see you and decide you're not worth helping." Her eyes widened slightly, and he saw the first crack in her armor. Slowly, carefully, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out his wallet. Annie flinched, but Michael just shook his head, smiling gently. "Here," he murmured, pulling out a small bill. "For now, let's just get you something decent to eat. Then we'll talk about what comes next." She stared at the money, then at him, suspicion warring with something else, something fragile and uncertain. You really want to help?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Michael nodded. "Yes," he said simply. "Because no one should have to go through this alone."
And as they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of her makeshift life, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. There would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. But for the first time, perhaps, Annie wouldn't have to face the darkness by herself. Because he wasn't just a stranger chasing a runaway. He was someone who saw her. Someone who cared.
And sometimes, in a world that was so quick to judge and discard, that was the first step towards something better, towards something like hope.
Michael and Annie, or rather Jada, as she had just told him, sat side by side on a worn park bench. The streetlights were starting to flicker on, casting a soft glow across the empty park. The chill of the evening air made Jada pull her thin jacket tighter around herself, her shoulders hunched in a way that made her look even smaller than she was. The backpack sat open between them, the sad assortment of items visible in the dim light, a tiny reflection of a childhood fractured by circumstances too harsh for any child to bear. Michael waited, giving her the space to speak on her own terms. He could see the war raging inside her, the fight between keeping her secrets close and the desperate need to unburden herself, if only for a moment.
Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she glanced at him, eyes clouded with a mix of guilt and defiance. "His name is Malik," she murmured, voice barely more than a whisper. Michael blinked, the words catching him off guard. "Malik," he repeated softly. Jada nodded, gaze dropping to the teddy bear cradled in her lap. Her fingers traced the worn fur, smoothing over its matted surface as if it were something precious and irreplaceable. "He's my little brother. He's only 6. Michael felt his chest tighten. There was so much pain in her voice, so much weight in those few words. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his movements slow, careful. "Where is he now?" A shudder ran through her small frame. "In the hospital," she murmured. He's been there for months. Leukemia. They say that he's really sick." Michael's breath caught. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, the words feeling inadequate in the face of her sorrow. He glanced down at the box of pads, the moldy sandwich. They weren't just the pitiful belongings of a homeless girl, they were all that a sister could scrape together to hold onto a sliver of normalcy. Is that why you've been?
Stealing, she finished for him, bitterness lacing her tone. Yeah, that's why she looked up at him then, eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate light. But not because I'm a thief, okay? I'm not that. I didn't have a choice.
Michael swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Tell me, he said gently, what did you need? Jada bit her lip, glancing down at the teddy bear again. Malik? He's so scared, she whispered, voice breaking. He's always been scared of doctors, and now, they're all around him, all the time. He used to have a bear one like this. She gestured to the worn toy. It was his favorite. But it got lost, somewhere in all the moving and all the hospital stays. Her fingers clenched around the bear, knuckles white. I thought if I could just find him another one, something to hold on to. Maybe he wouldn't be so scared. Maybe he'd think things would be okay again.
Michael's heart ached as he listened. This wasn't just a story of a girl stealing to survive, it was a story of a sister trying to protect the last bit of light in her brother's life. A sister who had lost everything and still clung to hope for a boy who was slipping through her fingers.
But why the food, he asked softly, nodding towards the sandwich, and the other stuff? Jada shrugged, the movement sharp and defensive. The nurses said I can't stay in his room all the time. They say it's hospital policy. She spat the words like a curse. But Malik gets so scared when I leave. He cries and then I can't. She trailed off, shaking her head furiously. I thought maybe if I brought him snacks I could have a reason to stay longer. And the pads, she flushed, looking away. Well, I'm a girl, aren't I? Sometimes you need things. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, fighting to keep his composure. She was just a child, forced to navigate a world that should never have asked so much of her. He looked back at her, eyes soft with understanding. Jada, he murmured gently, you didn't have to do this alone. There are people who can help. Help, she scoffed, the sound harsh and bitter. Like who? The social workers? The ones who took me away from my mom and stuck us in a group home where no one cared? Or the cops, the same ones who'll throw me in juvie if they catch me? Her voice shook, and for the first time Michael saw the raw vulnerability underneath the anger. She was tired, so tired. I tried asking for help, she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. But no one listens. No one really listens. And Malik, he's all I have left. The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Michael swallowed hard, blinking back his own tears. I'm listening, he said quietly. I promise. I'm here, and I'm listening. Jada sniffed, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. What good does that do, she muttered, but the fight was gone from her voice. She sounded broken, defeated. Michael hesitated, then reached out slowly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. It means that you don't have to carry this by yourself, he said softly. It means that maybe we can figure out a way to help Malik that doesn't involve you having to steal or lie or feel like you're alone. She stared at him, wide-eyed and disbelieving. You'd help. Yes, Michael murmured, his gaze steady and sincere. I will help, whatever it takes. For a long moment, Jada just looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, of hidden motives. Then, slowly, cautiously, she nodded.
Okay, she whispered, the words so soft it was almost lost in the night air. Okay, but, Malik, he comes first. Michael smiled gently. Of course, he murmured. We'll take care of Malik, together.
As they sat there on the park bench, with the city lights flickering on around them, Michael knew that they were standing at the beginning of a long, uncertain road. But for the first time, perhaps neither of them would be walking it alone. Because sometimes, the hardest part of fighting the darkness wasn't facing the shadows, it was finding the courage to reach out a hand and trust that someone would take it. And for Jada, for Malik, Michael knew he would do whatever it took to be that hand. As Michael dialed the number, his hands trembled slightly. The sound of Jada's soft sobs still echoed in his mind, her face etched with pain as she shared the heartbreaking reality of her world. It wasn't the story of a thief or a runaway, it was the story of a sister willing to break every rule to comfort her ailing brother, Malik. The name lingered on his tongue, heavy with the weight of a child's fragile hope. "Hey, it's Michael," he murmured into the phone, voice thick with emotion. "I need your help. Now." The voice on the other end, Nancy, a social worker he'd known for years, immediately picked up on his urgency. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern threading her tone. Michael glanced at Jada, who sat curled up on the bench beside him, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. She looked so small, so vulnerable. "I've got a situation. A young girl, Jada, and her little brother Malik, he's in the hospital. Leukemia. I need to get her to him, and..." He took a shaky breath. "I need to figure out how we can help." There was a beat of silence. Then Nancy's voice came back, firm and steady. "Where are you?" He told her, heart pounding as he explained what he'd learned. As the words spilled out Malik's illness, Jada's desperate attempts to stay close to him, the teddy bear meant to ease her brother's fear, Michael felt something shift inside him. But this was more than just a case. It was a call to something deeper, something that went beyond duty and protocol.
"We'll get her to him," Nancy said gently, "and I'll start looking into financial assistance for his treatment. It's not going to be easy, but we'll do what we can." "Thank you," Michael breathed, relief flooding through him. "Thank you."
He ended the call and turned back to Jada, who was watching him with wary eyes. "We're going to see Malik," he said softly. "And I've got someone who can help with the hospital bills, someone who cares." Jada blinked, disbelief warring with the faintest flicker of hope. You're not just saying that." "No," Michael murmured, shaking his head. "I'm not, I promise, Jada. We're going to get through this. Together."
The hospital room was small, almost unbearably sterile, its white walls broken only by the hum of medical equipment. Malik lay in the bed, his tiny form dwarfed by the machines that surrounded him. He looked impossibly fragile, his skin pale and almost translucent, his hair thin to soft wisps.
But when Jada stepped into the room, clutching the teddy bear to her chest, Malik's eyes lit up. "Jada," he whispered, voice faint but filled with a childlike wonder.
"Hey, Malik," Jada murmured, her voice trembling as she approached the bed. I brought you something."
She held out the bear, hands shaking, and Malik's eyes widened. "Mr. Bear," he breathed, reaching out with trembling fingers. But I thought he was gone." Tears welled in Jada's eyes as she knelt beside him. "This one's a little different, but he'll keep you safe, okay? Just like before."
Malik clutched the bear to his chest, his small body relaxing as a soft smile curved his lips. "Thank you," he murmured, voice barely more than a breath.
Michael stood by the door, heart aching as he watched the siblings reunite. The moment felt sacred, a fragile glimpse of innocence and love that seemed almost too pure for the harsh world outside. But even as he marveled at their bond, a knot of anger tightened in his chest. How could the world be so cruel? How could a child as sweet as Malik be burdened with a disease that stole his strength, his childhood? "Mr. Michael," the small voice broke through his thoughts, and Michael looked up to see Malik peering at him with wide, curious eyes. Are you here to help Jada?" Michael blinked, taken aback. I guess I am," he murmured softly, glancing at Jada. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation. Malik's gaze brightened, and he hugged the bear tighter. "Thank you," he whispered, "for bringing her back." Something cracked open in Michael's chest, a deep, aching warmth spreading through him. He cleared his throat, struggling to keep his composure. "You're welcome, buddy," he said gently. I'm glad you have each other."
Over the next few weeks, Michael kept his promise. He called Nancy, arranged meetings, and pushed for every bit of support he could find. The hospital bills, the insurance complications, the endless paperwork, it was a labyrinth of red tape and bureaucratic nonsense. But he fought through it, fueled by the memory of Malik's soft smile and Jada's fierce determination.
And slowly, piece by piece, things began to change. Nancy worked her magic, pulling strings and securing funding for Malik's treatment. Jada was enrolled in a local support program, ensuring she had a safe place to stay and resources to care for her brother. The burden that had weighed so heavily on her young shoulders began to lift, just a little. One day, Michael visited the hospital to find Malik sitting up in bed, the bear propped beside him. Jada sat close by, her face brighter, more relaxed than he'd ever seen. She looked up as he entered, and a smile, small but genuine, spread across her lips. "Michael," Malik called, his voice stronger now. "You came back."
"Of course I did," Michael said warmly, stepping into the room. "I told you, didn't I? We're in this together."
Malik's grin was radiant, and he leaned forward eagerly. I wanted to say thank you," he said, his small voice earnest. For helping Jada, and for Mr. Bear." Michael swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. "You're welcome, Malik," he murmured. "But I didn't do it alone. Your sister, she's the real hero." Jada blushed, ducking her head. I just wanted him to be okay," she whispered. "You did more than that," Michael said softly. "You made sure he didn't have to face this alone. And that's something incredible." For a long moment they sat in silence, the room filled with the quiet hum of the machines and the warmth of something deeper, something like hope. And as Michael left the hospital that day, he felt lighter. He had started this journey as just another officer, just another bystander. But now he knew better. Because sometimes, making a difference wasn't about catching the bad guys or enforcing the rules.
Sometimes it was about seeing the humanity in others, about choosing compassion over judgment, kindness over duty. And knowing that for Jada and Malik, he had been more than just a stranger.
He had been a friend, a lifeline, a reason to believe that, even in the darkest times, there was still light to be found.